Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Inept General, and welcome to our video on the top 5 Total War Warhammer campaigns so far. In this video, we're going to look at the Total War Warhammer series and pick out some of the best campaigns I've enjoyed playing, and hopefully you guys have too. Maybe give some recommendations to people who haven't tried out certain campaigns, and hopefully you enjoy this kind of look back at the campaigns we've had so far. Now, it looks like it'll be a little while till we get any new ones, at least until May, so let's get going, shall we? Now, I think the first point you need to address is what I think makes a good campaign, and for me it's several different things. It's about how engaging the campaign is, how good the mechanics are for that campaign, and a personal note for me, perhaps not as important to other people, is the lore, how it fits into the Warhammer world as it exists as far as the narrative is concerned, and I think perhaps most importantly is the kind of balance between having a fun campaign and having a challenging campaign as well. So I've tried not to focus so much on particular armies because I think armies suit people's different playstyles, and some people like some armies, some people like others. So this isn't really so much a look at the armies and how they play, more as the sort of the way the campaign flows. So, without further ado, guys, let's kick on with number 5. Now, at number 5, we have those haughty Frenchmen, Bretonnia. I've really enjoyed the Bretonnia free DLC we got in Total War Warhammer 1 that's carried over to Total War Warhammer 2. And to speak specifically about the campaign, for me, the best Bretonnian campaign is maybe a toss-up between the Fey Enchantress, because she has a lot of variety going on where she starts the game, and Louon Leoncoeur. But because Louon is the king, and, you know, slightly tips the balance at being a great little character as well, I think we're going to focus particularly on the campaign of Louon, and that's the one that makes number 5 on the list. Now, as far as the Bretonnian mechanics are concerned, they introduced a lot of different elements, including the peasantry system, where the idea was that manpower is limited, so if you take too many peasants off the field, it will start to affect your economy negatively. There was the idea of traits being cleared up in this DLC as well, whereby they tell you how you got traits, which was new to the series at the time, and also allowed you to clear negative traits by spending some time in a city with a Grail chapel, which I thought was a nice little touch there, the idea of praying to the goddess of the Bretonnian people for a certain amount of time, and all your negative traits would be washed away. There's also the idea, particularly in Louon's campaign, of the Greenskin Revolution, whereby because Louon can be a little bit isolated in the northern part of Bretonnia, Greenskin Revolutions pop up and you can farm experience, but also limit sort of how far away from your capital you want to go, particularly early game when your defenses aren't at their best, and leave your capital vulnerable while you go and take out a Greenskin settlement or even fight with Marienburg. And that's a fun little trilogy of problems you have to deal with there at the beginning of the game, and I kind of appreciated that. It was a great little element. Now, you can get rid of the Greenskin Revolution relatively easily if you really push it and just go for that settlement straight away, because especially when it first begins. But I like to farm it, and it adds a bit more tension to the campaign all over. There's also the notion of the Blessing of the Lady, whereby your armies would gain physical resistance bonuses if they kept fighting and kept winning. If you ever backed away from a fight, you'd lose that blessing, really encouraging you to play the way the lore sets out Bretonnian knights and their code of chivalry. They'll fight a suicidal battle rather than run away and disgrace the name of the lady. And that's kind of a theme that runs along the Bretonnian campaign, which got it into this top 5. The idea that they use mechanics to gently sort of nudge you in the playstyle of Bretonnia and the way they behave as a faction within the lore, but doesn't force your hand. If you don't want to do certain things, or situations dictate you behave in a certain way, like you lay an ambush or you have to sack a city for some gold, you're able to do it, and the negative effect isn't that great, but you can still just get benefits from playing the way that one might imagine a Bretonnian army would play in the Warhammer world. On that note, you also have the chivalric meter, which with good behavior like winning battles and sort of not running away and not losing negative traits, not setting ambushes, you build up this meter, which is effectively the measurement of the Bretonnian campaign. Now, every few stages, you get access to the Green Knight, the legendary hero of Bretonnia, who's this ghostly apparition who helps out Bretonnia in times times of dire need, and that's how that mechanic works. And I thought some people were upset that the Green Knight wasn't a permanent fixture, but I think as far as the law is concerned, it's a good way to implement him, the fact he's not always there, because no one can control the Green Knight. He's not under orders. He sort of goes where he wills and helps out where he can. So I kind of like the way they implemented the Green Knight. There's also a lot of variety to what you were fighting as Luon. You had Mousillon, the undead army faction, to your sort of southwest. You had the Norskins coming in and raiding from time to time from the north. You had the Greenskin revolutions earlier on. And then once you start to confederate with other Bretonnian states, then you have problems with the Beastmen, you have problems with the Wood Elves. I thought all over it gave you a lot of variety of different factions that you were fighting, and just kept the game interesting in that way. The implementation of the Bretonnian army itself I thought was pretty well done. They added in, I think, all of the units from the army. I don't think anything in particular was missing that I can remember. And they added in some new units, because Bretonnia, as far as the Warhammer game was concerned, hadn't had much attention for a number of years. And so Creative Assembly were able to fill in some of the gaps perhaps left by Games Workshop. To great effect, I think. I think it was very well done. My only gripe about the whole army that was implemented and the whole army you play with in the campaign is that there were better candidates to be legendary lords than Ulberic de Bordelot, but that's just my sort of personal shout out there, my personal gripe. And the Bretonnian campaign, also the lessons were learnt from earlier campaigns, that they had the final showdown with the Errantry Wars, which I think were pretty well done. The fact that you had to move an army all the way out to that territory to fight the final battle, I think was pretty great. In terms of the negatives for the Bretonnia campaign, and why it's perhaps not higher on my list, is that I think towards the back end of the middle and end of the campaign, it could get a little bit stale. You had to kind of force your way out of certain situations, the geography of Bretonnia. Now, if you don't care about the lore or allegiances or anything like that, and you're just trying to paint the map, then it's fine. It's absolutely fine. But if you're trying to stick to the lore a certain amount, you get hemmed in by the Empire on one side, you want to be allies with them, not necessarily fight them and completely take over. Although admittedly, in the lore, Bretonnia and the Empire have fought from time to time, but it's never been wars of massive conquest. And so that kind of paints you in a corner if you're trying to play true to the lore. Now, a lot of people won't do that, and a lot of people won't have been affected by it, but perhaps just my personal way I attribute these campaigns, it could get a little bit stale towards the ending of the campaign in terms of what you're doing, the options available to you at the time. Now, that's slightly alleviated in Total War Warhammer 2, where you're able to go down to Araby and perhaps launch another crusade, fight the Greenskins in the Badlands, which I suppose you're able to do in 1, but you wouldn't be able to settle. So the situation's made a bit better in Total War Warhammer 2, but towards Total War Warhammer 1 is what we're really kind of judging this on, I suppose. So that's the issue I had with the campaign and why it's not higher. So in conclusion, great campaign, fun campaign, good sense of lore in it, the fact it nudges you towards playing in a certain way, but just for me, slightly aimless towards the end of the campaign there, and could be, if you wanted to really push it, wrapped up actually fairly quickly. So that's about it for Bretonnia, guys. Number 5 on the list, had a great time playing them, love King Luon, love that campaign, it's really fantastic. Let me know what you guys think of it down in the comments below. But moving on, let's go to number 4. Now, number 4, ladies and gentlemen, is my man, none other than Wulfric the Wanderer, and the Norscan campaign. The last piece of DLC for Total War Warhammer 1, the one we were hoping would come with launch with Total War Warhammer 2, or at least when the Mortal Empires campaign. We await it keenly for the arrival in May, but the Norscan campaign was great. I really enjoyed it. As you guys know, I've done a full video on Wulfric. Love the guy. He's a loon. Do check it out in the top right-hand corner now, or you'll find a link in the description below if you want to watch it after this video. And all in all, I thought it introduced a whole bunch of fun new mechanics. So let's go through some of those, shall we? We had the mechanic of trying to appease one of the 4 Chaos Gods. And then once you appease one of those gods fully, you're able to go into the end game, fight off the challengers to your title as a champion of Chaos. And when you've defeated all of them, you've essentially won the campaign. Now, I think one problem I had with this was that as you got up the tree for the favor with each god, you'd get bonuses. Now, if you did the math, it was possible to get 2 of the 3 bonuses for every god, and then finish off with 1 of the gods. Now, I tried to do this being a completionist, and for me this represented a lot of busy work. It perhaps isn't the best way to play the campaign. Now, I appreciate that maybe someone should just jump in and do a single god, and that could be a much quicker campaign and a much easier way to do it. But the completionist in me was annoyed by the fact that you maybe couldn't get all the bonuses. This is maybe just my own playstyle that hampered me in my enjoyment of this mechanic in particular. But I just feel like allow you to gain favor completely with one god, but then in the end game, I think they should open it up a little bit and allow you to maybe go and get those other bonuses just for the sake of completionism. It annoyed me that I couldn't get the others and I'd have to do separate playthroughs to get those. But that's the only thing that really irked me about that system. I loved it, and I think it's a system that could actually be transferred across to the full Chaos faction after some time, perhaps in the 3rd game. But great mechanic, just for the completionist in me, grinded my gears a little bit. The next one they introduced was the idea of the Great Hunts. Now, this was where you would be able to hunt down mammoths or protect mammoths in the case of the hunt for that one. You'd be able to kill a farty giant. You'd be able to take down a frost dragon. All these things would give you bonuses and allow special units to join your army in certain cases. Now, this was great, but one of the things that perhaps just sort of rubbed me up the wrong way lore-wise from this perspective was the fact that Wulfric particularly, maybe not Frog the King of Trolls, but Wulfric is more of a hunter of men. So I felt that it would have been great, particularly as there are traits for killing other legendary lords, to have Wulfric having to hunt down the other legendary lords rather than having to hunt down monsters. Now, Wulfric is up for all challenges, so he'll happily take on a monster, but I just thought there was something missing there that would have been a great addition to have Wulfric have to wander the world, thus his name, Wulfric the Wanderer, and kill the other legendary lords. I think that would have been a great little game changer there. But hopefully we maybe see that at some point in the future, or at least a mod for that at some point. It would be a great little game mechanic. Now, as far as the army is concerned, the Norscan army is a creation of Creative Assembly. I think they did a really good job of pulling in different aspects of the lore of the region of Norsca and assembling it into a really fun army to play. So I have to add sort of an extra round of applause for that. With the single exception of the animations of the wolf chariots. If any of you guys have seen my Wulfric campaign, you'll know I had a real problem with the animation of those wolf chariots. My only other small gripe with the campaign as a whole is that once, as I mentioned before, you gain the favor of one of the Chaos gods, you then have to wait for the challengers to find you, or you have to find them. You're not necessarily aware of their position. Some of them will stay in certain places, others will come after you. So it can get a bit tricky and makes the end game a little bit sloppy, particularly if you're far away from Norsca when you trigger the end sequence, just to try and find these armies and fight them down. Although some of them are coming straight for you, it can just get a bit weird. You're not sure when it's going to end, and it can drag on a little bit. Apart from that, I really enjoyed the campaign in terms of most of the aspects. I've made most of my gripes known at this stage, but I just feel like for the completionist, it can maybe have some hindrances, and I think just that ending, as I mentioned, with the units can be a little bit sloppy. But overall, a hugely enjoyable campaign with units we never thought we'd see, or at least I never expected to see in Total War Warhammer. So all in all, really thoroughly enjoyed it, earning it the number 4 spot, and you know, just some things for me holding it back from climbing higher up the list, but can't recommend it enough when it comes out in May for Total War Warhammer 2, if any of you haven't picked it up already.
We fought monsters, and we became them.
Rolling on to number 3, and at number 3 we have the newest of the campaigns, the Tomb Kings. Now, I've tried to be pretty specific in terms of the last 2 entries, with the Luon campaign and the Wulfric campaign being the ones that I really enjoyed. Now, in the Tomb Kings, it's a little bit harder, because the elements I enjoyed most about the Tomb King campaign was really kind of more mechanical than necessarily the sort of overall campaign itself. I really enjoyed the new mechanics they brought in, and thus it becomes harder to distinguish them. So let's talk through the one I'm maybe going to focus on and sort of my issues with the others to a certain degree, just give you a bit of an overall view of my thoughts on the Tomb King campaigns. So, Khalida I liked, but I think was slightly isolated in both the Vortex and Immortal Empires campaign. For those of you who don't perhaps know, Warhammer has two campaigns, Total War Warhammer 2. One called the Vortex, which focuses on the area known as the New World. Is a little bit more of a narrative there, and one is a bit more sandboxy, which encompasses most of the, let's say, populated or important Warhammer world. And those are the two we're talking about here. Now, in both of those, Khalida starts in a place that leaves her, for my money, a little bit isolated. In Lebaras, she has a couple of things to fight, and I think Lebaras at least had me more invested because it's her actual home city in the Mortal Empires campaign. In terms of the Vortex campaign, she's down there in the southern sort of tip of the land, and then just fighting Skaven in the jungles of Lustria, which has no real narrative drive. Like, what's she doing over there? I know she's after the Books of Nagash, but for me, it wasn't really sort of ticking my boxes, as it were. And I feel when she's fighting in Lebaras, that mountain range and, like, with pieces of land that aren't as attractive to a Tomb King faction, make you, or at least made me feel that I ended up getting her a bit isolated in that bit. You could fight Krokgar for a bit, you could fight your way through the mountains into the desert, but that's a lot of Tomb King on Tomb King action, a lot of sort of fighting your way out of her little box and into the wider map as a whole. Katep, again, same thing, motivational factor for me. The Grand Hierophant in the middle, a good challenge just mechanically, if that's what you're after. But for me, couldn't get behind it sort of emotionally, shall we say, because of his isolated fight. The fact he's up there fighting Dark Elves and stuff, kind of I can set that aside in my mind. Settra seems the natural choice, starting in the actual capital of Khemri. You could go around, you could conquer. I think Settra's maybe kind of the default one that you'd go for. But for me, what really won it over is Arkhan the Black's Vortex campaign. Because a lot of the Tomb King's narrative in the Vortex is about getting the Books of Nagash, and I think Arkhan has the best motivation to do that. For those of you who don't know, Nagash is the big bad of the Warhammer world, one of them at least, and he is responsible for all the undead creatures that go around, and his right-hand guy is Arkhan. Now, Arkhan is not allied with the other Tomb Kings. In fact, he's their arch nemesis. So I like that from the story's perspective, that it made most sense for him to be going around doing what the campaign needs, and adds one of the new mechanics, which is the Books of Nagash. Going around collecting them leads on the narrative and allows you to complete the game. Now, he's the one who has the best motivation to do that, and as such, I think the best Tomb King campaign for me is Arkhan the Black's Vortex campaign, which is a weird thing to say, but yeah, that's one that I think we'll go for as far as the number 3 spot is concerned. Now, in terms of the mechanics, I mentioned already the idea of the Books of Nagash. My only problem with this new mechanic is that I like the fact you could go around, do certain things to get these books in order to try and resurrect Nagash if you're playing as Arkhan, and it would give you army bonuses and faction bonuses and stuff like that. But I didn't like the fact that in certain elements, perhaps for other campaigns in Mortal Empires and the like, you can get the books hidden in an ally city, and then you still have to rampage over that city to take them. I think if you're an ally, a full-on ally, you should be able to get that book automatically, rather than have to sack or raise the city that the book's in, because that just breaks apart your alliances and can make the game, I suppose, a little bit trickier, but just unnecessarily so. It just seems like a weird thing to do. So that's my only gripe, and it seems like something they could have easily taken away from the ways that the books can appear. Just don't make them appear in a maybe allied city, or at least have it so if you do get an allegiance with the city, they just give you the book. That would be a good way to also kick your sort of diplomacy into gear as well. The next mechanic we're going to talk about is the fact that the Tomb Kings did very interesting thing where they made units not cost you any money, and that you'd only be restricted by unit caps. I thought this was a really fantastic and interesting way to play, because the Tomb Kings obviously don't raise anything with money, and so gave it a new interesting mechanic whereby you could have armies just full of sort of trash units, but if you wanted those elite units to come in, you really had to build up and expand and sort of get your structures up and running in order to have a half-decent army to fight off enemies with. So I really like this mechanic. I thought it really shifted the whole thing, and it's one of the sort of prime reasons for Tomb Kings being so high, just that completely different way of playing compared to other Total War factions, and the different things you had to consider, really showing us something new there. The other thing is, I think it was a great use of the secondary currency, more so than any of the other factions, such as the High Elves with their influence, the Dark Elves with their slaves, the Skaven with their food, was the jars that you'd get for the Tomb Kings. The fact you could spend them on different things, you could get generals with them in research, you could also go to the shop. The idea that you could just go and get and buy magical items, buy regiments of renown, was a really fantastic thing. And this tied it into and reminded me, I actually stealing this from an article, but reminded me of a Heroes of Might and Magic game that I used to play when I was younger. I'm not sure if they make them anymore. I think they're an Ubisoft property. I think Creative Assembly, particularly in the Warhammer series, seems to have taken a lot of sort of different bits and pieces from that. Now, if you've ever seen my Skaven Underworld Theory video, again, popping up in the top right hand corner now, which I made a little while ago before the release of Total War Warhammer 2, maybe one day we might see an underworld in the Warhammer universe shared by dwarven tunnels and Skaven warrens and stuff like that, as they do in Heroes of Might and Magic. Maybe they'll take that lesson as well. But let's get back to the point, and that's that. I just really like the shop. I thought it was a great new thing that we haven't seen before, thoroughly enjoyable. I think in terms of Archon's, Kalida's, and Cetra's campaigns to a certain extent, you have to fight a lot of Tomb Kings. Now, in Archon's case, I kind of get it. Like, he's enemies with the Tomb Kings, and the fact that you have some vampire count units makes it a bit more interesting. You have to use different tactics. But for the other Tomb Kings, Kalida and Cetra in particular, having to fight so many other Tomb King factions, particularly early in the game, can get a bit trying, and the Tomb Kings do have a truly annoying AI trait. Not as annoying as Chariots. Nothing's ever been as annoying as the Norscan Chariots, but was the use of Tomb Swarm, where if you had your factions going, they just launch off a Tomb Swarm, which could do devastating damage on your army, more so than any of their units ever do. And it just became like just spamming Tomb Swarm all the time. Having to fight Tomb King so much in the early part of the game just proved a real annoyance for me, and that's sort of one of the negatives against it. Let me know if you guys had that same problem. It might just be me, but just AI spamming Tomb Swarm is just a true annoyance when fighting Tomb Kings, particularly if you have to do so much as a Tomb King yourself early on in the game. Now, I acknowledge that you do obviously get a chance to fight some dwarves there early on. If you're Kalida, you do get to fight the Undead and Krokgar, the Lizard Men, and the Skaven to a certain extent once you start to break out of your little area there. But it takes a little while, and you do have to still fight a lot of Tomb Kings. So that's just my issue there. It just got to grind my gear, made it a bit tedious at certain points, particularly in early campaign. The next negative I have for the Tomb King campaign, and bear in mind, these are all great campaigns, that's why they're on this list to begin with, but just have to point out some negatives, which is why Tomb Kings perhaps isn't higher on the list for me, was the lack of subtlety in the way that Creative Assembly approached confederations. Now, confederations is much harder to do in Total War Warhammer 2 than it was in Total War Warhammer 1, simply because the legendary lords are so much more spread out, particularly confederating for a legendary lord, I mean, in this case. But the idea of confederating for the Tomb Kings, they just said no one can confederate, which struck me as very bizarre, particularly, like, Cetra, I get no one can confederate Cetra into their faction. Let him be a character when controlled by the AI who never confederates. Fair enough. Now, Kalida will sometimes follow Cetra's orders. Like, she'll go along. Like, she's part of Cetra's kingdom. So, the fact that Kalida won't follow Cetra if you're playing as Cetra is a bit weird. So, technically, Kalida should be able to confederate as Cetra. Same with Katep. Katep should come into the fold as well if you're able to, playing as Cetra. Now, the other thing is that Archon, completely understandable. Archon should not be able to confederate with any of them. He's their enemy. Completely get it. But that lack of subtlety between, like, allowing Cetra to control Kalida and Katep kind of makes you not have more than one legendary lord in your army at a time. I get that they say they gave you, like, generals in the research, like unique generals, compared to Alistair, a special general they made for a Make-A-Wish kid in the High Elves, but looks very distinctive from any of the other High Elf generals. But you know what, call me a mummyist or whatever have you, I can't really tell the difference looking at those generals. I don't really get behind them as unique characters when you get them out of the research tree, but maybe I'm mummyist and I see them all the same. That's probably my fault. But anyway, so that's one of my unique gripes, is that, like, let me have the other legendary lords if I'm playing as Settra. It's one of the bonuses of being bloody Settra, is that everyone does what he says for the most part. So that was one of the disappointing things. They took kind of a hammer to a job that perhaps required a knife. It's just a bit of a disappointing thing that they just could have spent time on, and I understand the mechanics have to be there to allow it to happen as well, one would think. So one of the gripes against this campaign as well, that's more of a general one, I suppose, rather than strictly an Archon-focused critique. On the plus side, their rights seemed a bit more useful, or a bit more fun, I should say, than the rights of some of the earlier factions in Total Warhammer 2. I found myself using them a lot more than I did for, say, the founding factions of Total War Warhammer 2, which was a great implementation. Same with some of the stances. I thought it was a good mix of lore and stuff like that to make the stances fun for the Tomb Kings. Now, in terms of the army itself, I thought it was wonderfully rendered. It's a beautiful looking army. My only gripe with the way the army works is the Ushabti. Now, the Ushabti, for those of you who don't perhaps know, are statues that have had warriors' souls implanted into them, bringing them to life. Now, they're brought to life with the souls of warriors, not with the mechanics of 1950s clockwork robots, which is the way they seem to function in Total War Warhammer. They'll do a swipe, reset to the same position, move kind of robotically, and it was just one of those weird animation choices I couldn't get behind. Not a huge critique, but as all of these campaigns are good, we're really just looking at tiny things here to justify their position on the list. And for me, that Ushabti thing really grind, much like the Wolf Chariot of the Wolfric. Tiny thing, but just a minor annoyance for me. Let me know if you guys liked it or not down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions on it. Overall, the Tomb Kings, particularly Archon's Vortex narrative-driven campaign, was a great campaign, maybe slightly hamstrung in terms of climbing to the very top of this list by the position of certain factions, as well as having to force you to do multiple playthroughs if you want to try out different legendary lords in single player for the Tomb Kings. Like, those are my only two main gripes and why the Tomb Kings aren't higher on the list. But as I said, guys, with all of these, they're all thoroughly fun campaigns. So can't recommend it enough. Really good campaign. But let's move on, guys, to number 2 on the list. And I think this one's going to surprise a few people. Number 2 on the list is the Wood Elves mini campaign. Now, for this one, I don't think we need to distinguish between Orion the Legendary Lord and Durthu the Legendary Lord, because on the mini-campaign, I mean, they're kind of close to each other. It's slightly different, but for the sake of this, we'll say it's one and the same. Now, this might surprise a lot of people. Wood Elves was the second DLC for Total War Warhammer 1. It brought to life the Forest of Athel Loren. Do you guys remember all that time ago when it was just a dead bit of map? But now very much lived in. Now, I picked the mini-campaign for a couple of reasons, because I think it's actually more fun than the Wood Elf campaign on the Grand campaign. Now, this mini-campaign was coming off the criticism of the DLC for the Beastmen, which also had a mini-campaign, but was not nearly as enjoyable. People really didn't like it. They thought it brought additional time and money and drove up the price of the DLC that people didn't want. However, for me, the money was well worth it for the Elven one. The Beastman one was not as much fun. You'd be hounded around the map. It wasn't as attractive a map either. But they really brought to life the Forest of Athel Loren and Bretonnia more widely as well. They added in areas of Bretonnia such as Massive Orcal. You got a sense in Athel Loren of the different regions of the forest, which have very different traits. There's more than just 4 sections of Athel Loren. It's a much more sort of nuanced and complicated realm than that, and I think this mini-map really helped bring that to life in the way it should be in the Warhammer world. The campaign itself played very much like you'd expect from a Wood Elf campaign. You had threats from Greenskins storming in from Massive Orcal, an area that isn't even covered in the Mortal Empires campaign or the Grand campaign of Warhammer 1. Now, this was a mountain range in the middle of Bretonnia where a massive amount of orcs and goblins live, and they pour into the forest. You have the ever-present threat of beastmen trying to take your forest away from you, popping up in random areas of the map, charging straight towards your Oak of Ages in a bid to burn it down. You had the odd, cheeky Bretonian thinking they could get high ideas and come into your forest to be taught a very harsh lesson when you ride out on a wild hunt to burn down parts of Quinel. all of this served to really bring together exactly what I imagined a Wood Elf campaign would be like, how the Wood Elves would behave in the Warhammer world. It really allowed you to inhabit the lore of the Wood Elves and really go along with the way that they play. And I think that was great. I think in terms of lore to mechanics to play, to the way things look, to the way things behave in the Warhammer world, the Wood Elf mini campaign is the top of that list in terms of that merger of those three elements. So that's why it's so high up on this list for me. It also introduced a couple of new mechanics. There was the idea, before we had Settle Anywhere in Total War Warhammer 2, we had the Wood Elves who were the first faction to be able to settle anywhere, building their small outposts, which were kind of hard to defend, but would give you bonuses and bring you amber, which was their vital secondary currency, which would drive on the way they were able to build up the Oak of Ages, which, if you got to maximum level, marked the end of the Wood Elf campaign. And you also got the introduction of seasons, which allowed you to make the most use of particularly Orion when the season was right. So I think all of that played into the wonderful marriage, shall we say, of lore, the fun and challenging campaign, particularly around the end. If you don't know what to expect, I think is one of the key aspects of this campaign. Now, I say this because the first time you play it through, there are surprises, you don't know what to expect, stuff really gets to you. The second time you play through, and even towards the end of perhaps your first campaign, you start to be able to read the mechanics of what's going on, which takes away slightly from the enjoyment. But I think the first time you play through this campaign is really fantastic, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Even if you maybe didn't pick up Warhammer 1, don't just pick it up for this, but if you're picking it up, do try out the Wood Elf DLC minimap. I think it's a great little campaign, particularly if you're a fan of the Wood Elves, unmissable. So that's it. Really, in conclusion, a fun campaign. I loved it. A fantastic way of really allowing you to live out the Wood Elf way of life, the way it would be as one imagines it in the Warhammer universe, and the surprise and challenge of a constant threat to your forest, allowing you to play a much more defensive style, just holding out your forest. You could paint the map if you wanted to, but it really sort of encouraged that defensive style, and you could really set yourself in the role if that's the kind of thing you're looking for. On the negative side, for me, why it's not higher on the list is simply the fact that it's not really replayable. Once you know how it works, once you know what to do, you can cheat the system, as it were. It becomes very less challenging. It becomes not really much of an ordeal at all, which really takes away from a lot of it. So its biggest fault is it doesn't really have a huge amount of replayability once you've gone through it the first time. And that's why it didn't take the #1 spot. So we've gone through it all, guys. Let's go through the final bit. The last, but by no means least, my #1 campaign in Total War Warhammer series so far, and that is the King and the Warlord. Belegar and Skarsnik going head-to-head over their want-to-be home of Karak 8 Peaks. Belegar, the king driven out generations ago of Dwarfkind, and Skarsnik, one of the current occupiers, along with Queek, and I suppose Belegar's leading an expedition technically in the lore now as well. So it's the idea of these guys fighting. Now, Creative Assembly had a challenge on their hands in terms of implementing this idea that they're all fighting within the same city. What they decided to do was move both of these guys away from the city and make it a race to get back there to take it over. Very interesting element, not really lore accurate at all. Now, for me, you might already be saying, from the criteria I've been using as far as like ways to go on the campaign, it's not really accurate to lore, so does that not sort of rule it out? And I have to say, perhaps so, but the thing is that all the other elements of this campaign were so enjoyable, they almost override the fact that the lore is kind of nonsense. Even stuff like his ghost companions, which, again, complete lore nonsense. They're meant to represent the idea his ancestors are behind him. Silly, silly stuff. But I suppose it's all silly stuff if you actually break it down. The ghost allies are fun to play with, but again, not really part of the lore. And I think that really sums up almost this entire campaign and my enjoyment of it. The lore isn't really there. There is very much the idea that you're all trying to get back to Karak 8 Peaks, but the fun of the campaign is so much so that it overrides maybe a lot of those aspects. Now, why is this campaign so fun in my view? Well, for those of you who perhaps don't know, what they did is that because both of them are trying to get back to this city, is that they made you have a massive economic penalty for your guys. Now, this might seem a very simple thing until you can retake the city. Now, I think it was 50% if I remember correctly. What's the big deal about that? But the things it forced you to do with a 50% economic penalty was you had to build up your cities and make them defensible, and at some point you could slowly build and conquer very, very slowly towards the end goal of Karak 8 Peaks, but that was not really the best strategy because you'd always have a 50% economic penalty. So you'd never have enough armies to guard the territory you'd get, making them very susceptible to conquest from your enemies. So really what it took was building up your defenses enough that you could trust that they could hold out for enough time for you to make a move over to Karak 8 Peaks, take it over, and then sort of start empire building from there, giving you faction bonuses once you took Karak 8 Peaks. Now, this was a great balance because you started in areas both as Skarsnik and as Belegar, potentially surrounded by enemies. For Belegar, I think you had greenskins. I think there was the potential threat of the Wood Elves, although I'm not 100% sure if that was an aspect yet. But there was a potential threat of Wood Elves, maybe not when it first came out, but there is now. And you also had the Border Princes if they got a bit cheeky, and you had sort of factions of the Empire that could come down on you, as well as your other Dwarven clans that might sometimes declare war on you. For Skarsnik, you had the Empire on your doorstep. Later on, you had the Wood Elves being able to pop up in your mountain range right behind you. You had Belegar himself to your south, and you had another Dwarven faction right next to you as well. So you always had these enemies. You started in positions where enemies were all around you potentially, and so to make the run to Karak 8 Peaks took a lot of sort of timing and planning. It probably wasn't as tricky as it ended up being. There's probably ways, once you know the mechanics really well, that it's not a challenge at all. But the first time or two or three even that you go through it, and I've played this campaign a lot of times, and it's still always fun trying to pick that right time to then make a run across to Karak 8 Peaks and to try and take it. Particularly if you didn't get too cheesy on the siege itself, it could be quite a challenge. The package itself introduced a couple of new units and stuff, but they're not really the stars of the show. You did get Bugman's Rangers, but on the whole, like, it's that challenge. It's that economic challenge of being able to say, like, okay, I trust my cities will be safe for X amount of time to make the run. Let's go see if we can survive the trip and get to Karak 8 Peaks and take it over all in one go to try and allow our economy to kickstart and actually get your campaign going as far as achieving the overall objectives. But that initial build-up, I just had so much fun every time I played it, and I played it a great number of times. It's kind of amazing what they've done with simple repositioning on a map of certain characters and how much different they made that, because fundamentally, it's not that much different from a Dwarven campaign except for that Karak 8 Peaks challenge. Or a greenskin campaign in the case of Skarsnik. My only criticism, as I've said, really, is just that it doesn't really stick to any lore. It's not really that lore-friendly. But just to have the characters, I suppose, is enough to a certain degree. Now, another criticism one might mount now is that they haven't gone back and revisited that element with the idea of Queek being in this situation, because the fight over Karak 8 Peaks is really a three-way fight. You need some fight at the end involving all three of these characters to really bring that narrative to a close. Now, admittedly, lore, as I just said, is the weakest part of this campaign, but it'd be nice to get Queek involved in that and to sort of tie them all up, all three of them together. But that's something that came much later after the release of the campaign. So, all in all, for me, the funnest campaign I've had, probably the best time I've had playing the series so far, is that Belegar campaign. Let me know what you guys think. What's your #1 pick for the top 5? Let me know down in the comments below. Would love to hear your feedback. Now, I will say as a bit of a disclaimer here, I'm going back and looking at the list. They are all DLCs. Now, admittedly, the Bretonnia one is a free LC, or a free DLC if you prefer. And that is not me trying to hawk these DLCs on you, but just kind of maybe just a natural consequence of the way that the game building has gone on at Creative Assembly. The fact that when they release the games, there's 4 factions and they all have a lot more in common. They're all a bit sort of basic foundational level factions. And then when they go off to create a DLC for one specific race, it's no wonder that those become slightly more interesting campaigns than the ones you get with the starting game. So just a bit of a disclaimer there if anyone's like, oh, he's just trying to sell DLC. Not at all. If anything, guys, maybe use this as a guide. Anyway, guys, that's about it from me. Hope you enjoyed this video. I figured, you know what, it's about time I put up a YouTube top something video. That seems to be the way that people do these things. If you're on the fence about any of these DLCs, they're all great, they're all fun. I can't recommend any of them enough. If you enjoyed this and it's your first time to the channel, do check out some of my playlists for some lore on Total War Warhammer, some gameplay videos. But hope you guys enjoyed this. As always, thank you for watching and hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright guys, bye.